I picked the wrong job and I, kept finding these bad opportunities. And the punchline of the story is it was me. And I didn't realize how much power I had to change my situation. And I didn't realize that instead of waiting for an employer to give you purpose and meaning and opportunities and joy, that it was in your hands to create those things, even in an entry-level role. So the biggest one to me is the wheelbarrow rut of I believe that my job should make me feel good and fulfilled and meaningful, instead of what I believe now, which is it is my job to make sure I am having a meaningful experience. And that is my responsibility, not the people around me.
Hi, Zandy. Years ago, I was talking with a relative about his job, and the way he described it, his job was just sucking the life out of him. Between what seemed like incompetent bosses, unmotivated coworkers, and I'd say just an overall lack of opportunity, he was counting down his days until retirement. The only problem? He had something like 8 years to go before he could retire. And he was vested enough in the pension at his organization that leaving just didn't seem like a viable option. All he could see was a workplace desert of no joy, no meaning, and no opportunities for years ahead. And he was dreading another Monday morning. Now, your situation's likely different, but it's just a matter of time before you have to work with an imperfect boss, right? Or unmotivated coworkers, or an imperfect organizational culture while being tasked with juggling more work than you can handle. And that's how a lot of people would describe their work experience these days. Now, perhaps an obvious solution is just quit, right? Go take another job. But that's not always as simple as it may sound. What if there was a way to find more joy and meaning and opportunities in the job you already have? That's what we're talking about today. Elizabeth Lotardo joins us today. She's the author of a new book entitled Leading Yourself. That's the book subtitle says it all. Find more joy, meaning, and opportunities in the job you already have, despite imperfect bosses, weird economies, lethargic coworkers, annoying systems, and too many deliverables. Brilliant. In today's discussion, you'll learn why we often start a new role with great anticipation, only to find ourselves a year later, like my relative, dreading Monday morning. We'll talk about the role of purpose and passion in finding more joy at work and which one of those two isn't necessarily required. Ever dread having to go to a meeting with a difficult stakeholder? Well, Elizabeth will share some insights to help. We'll talk about receiving feedback and so much more. I can't wait to share the discussion with you. A quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into our discussion with Elizabeth about her new book, Leading Yourself. Hey, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks for having me, Andy. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, I am too. I'm so glad you joined us. We can start a job or career with great anticipation. And like you say in the book, and like I said during the intro, sometimes a year later, sometimes it's a month later, but at some point we're dreading Monday morning. So what are some of those top factors that can suck joy out of our work experiences?
Well, that experience happens to everyone, whether it happens in a really dramatic way, like your relative, or
Right.
whether it happens in a subtle way, like you're just not as excited as you were when you first got this job. There's always something that kind of takes the wind out of our sails. And it's captured in the subtitle, which you laugh through because it is so true,
Yes.
which are these things like imperfect bosses, lethargic coworkers, weird economies, too many deliverables, and annoying systems that don't work together. These things are ever present in the world of work. They're not always dialed up to 100, but an element of them is always there. And when we're entering into a new job, we think they won't be there this time. And this time will be so different. And we're often hurt in the fact that it's not.
Yeah, I can see it over the course of my career. And it's never all those things, maybe, and never all the time, but just waves of it. And when I look back at what's helped me at times, you talk about the role of purpose in leading ourselves. And I think maybe over the time, in fact, maybe until I read your book, I would have used purpose and passion somewhat interchangeably. But Tell us why it's actually okay if you're not passionate about your job and why that's maybe good news.
I would have used them interchangeably too until I came upon some research several years ago from Professor Morton Hansen. He's out of
Mm,
the University of California, Berkeley. And what he studied was the difference between these two words, purpose
yeah.
and passion, that we often lump together. And what he found is that passion, being excited about the work, thinking it's really interesting, is not as impactful on how we feel about the work or how we do with the work than the feeling of purpose, believing that the work matters, that it's having an impact, that it means something to someone.
Right.
That feeling of purpose has a drastically more significant impact on how we feel about the work, which in turn has a big impact on how we do at work.
Yeah.
And the challenge is we live in a culture where we think everything should be really exciting and cool and interesting. And we cost ourselves a lot in hoping that it will be.
Yeah, I can think of times where it's like, I feel really passionate about this. And if we feel like, oh no, I don't feel passionate, then this job sucks or I gotta leave, that's not the real world, right? But the purpose can sustain us more than that passion. Is that kind of the idea?
Ideally, you want both. And I
Right.
hope there's elements in your career that are giving you both. But if you're
Mhm.
not waking up like so hype about something, that's okay. If you can dial into the sense of purpose and impact that it's having, you'll feel better in the long term and you'll do better.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So after a keynote at a financial services company, I talked to this guy who he confided me that at his company, all we do, Elizabeth, is make rich people richer. That's what he said. And now his organization had a purpose, but he just wasn't feeling it. So it could be that if someone's, completely, not aligned with their company's purpose, they should look elsewhere, I suppose. But what are some of your favorite ways to coach people to better understand their purpose, even if they maybe, don't have the type of we're going to try to save the world sort of job? What do you think?
There's a lot to unpack in that question, and it's a gripe I hear a lot.
Yeah.
And to me, what sits beneath it is one, this belief that purpose is reserved for people who are feeding the poor, for
Right.
teachers, for nurses, for firefighters. And if you work in a corporate job, that's something that you don't get to have, right? You've sold out. So debunking that societal or individual belief comes first. But what comes next is if the organization is making, to use this gripey language, rich people richer,
Mm.
what happens from that? One could suggest, and the data would tell you, that there are more generous charitable contributions, right? When people have accumulated wealth. So there's something to be said for that.
Mm.
You could hypothesize that the wealth transfer to women and minorities is accelerating. And as a result, the work you're doing has an impact on that. But I think what's more important than trying to tether yourself to some, like, if you've deemed it fake corporate purpose or just like window dressing on this not meaningful thing, is to think about you as an individual. And if you can't rally around whatever statement your organization has like slapped on their website called a purpose, it is up to you to find an element of your job that you find meaningful. It doesn't have to be this gigantic thing. It is up to you to tether yourself to, you know what, I make my coworkers' lives easier because I keep these projects running on time and everyone gets to go home at the end of
Mhm.
the day. It is up to you to say, you know what, I bring creativity and innovation into this and I'm always
Mm.
willing to, hear a new perspective or offer a new take. What are you doing to create that sense of meaning and purpose instead of saying, oh, well, our company has a purpose, but it's dumb and that doesn't do anything for me? So the orientation away from, we don't have a purpose, it's not noble, this one that they've set, it's not true, towards, how am I going to make this meaningful for me? All of that on the other side.
What we ended up doing in the conversation was what you call the ripple effect kind of exercise. Would you mind just even kind of mention what that is? Because it actually resonated with him, even though I didn't have the vocabulary because I hadn't read your book at the time.
Well, I'm not the originator of the term ripple effect, but what I do
Oh,
suggest
let's go with that.
in the book is to create what I call an impact map, which is a visual articulation of that ripple effect, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We do so much every day and it escapes our field of vision. Your emails get forwarded around to other departments. Your work ends up, changing and it's malleable and it ends up with some customer and you don't see the end product like you wanted to. And being able to articulate how what you do actually matters, the ripple effect it has, because it's not obvious, that fuels your sense of purpose. So that email you send saying, we're all going to circle back on the timeline of this project. What does that do? Okay, well, it gets everyone back on the same page. Your priority is greater on this project. And then what does that do? You deliver it in a more timely manner. The customers who are depending on it have what they need. So being able to push from this thing that I gotta do at the center outward to
Mm.
articulate why does it matter, that is a skill that will serve you in this job and every one you have after it.
Yeah, I really think that's true. Yeah. I've found, Elizabeth, that if I'm convinced my boss is incompetent and unreasonable, I'm quite capable of finding all the data I need to know I'm correct. And if I'm sure those young people these days, hitting the workplace are entitled and they won't work hard, I'm sure I could find some examples to parade out as evidence. And this phenomenon, it can keep me in a rut of not leading myself, as you call it, because I've got this wheelbarrow full of reasons to stay right there with those thoughts. So, what are some of the common workplace lies we believe? And what's an example of how you personally have had to try to dismantle some of those in your own workplace experience somewhere over the course of your career?
So the essence of this practice is if you think about a negative belief or an assumption, right? Like my boss is this big idiot who hates me.
Yeah.
Think about that like you're pushing a wheelbarrow through a rut. And every time you push the wheelbarrow through that rut, the rut gets deeper and deeper. It gets more defined and more defined. And the more defined that rut becomes, it's almost like it's pulling your wheelbarrow right into the center of that groove. And it's impossible to break out of. That's what happens in our mind when we tell ourselves things like, my boss is so annoying and so disorganized, or my company doesn't care about me, or Generation Z, all they want to do, TikTok, blah, blah, blah. Any of these assumptions that we continuously rehearse to ourselves cost us a lot because our wheelbarrow, the experience we're having
Mm,
at work, gets pulled into them by default
yeah.
over time. So it's crucial to recognize those before they become like super, 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 super deep
Yeah.
and proactively work to put your wheelbarrow in a different direction. And the most effective way I've found to do that is to lean on the data, right? Because you can't really convince yourself out of
Mm,
it.
mm,
So if you believe that we'll take the young people, all they want to do, entitled, lazy, TikTok, I hate
mm,
everybody on Generation Z.
mm.
The data would suggest that this phenomenon of hating on the previous generation has been in actuality for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? There's this quote from Aristotle about how all the young people are entitled and lazy and they have no manners.
That's funny.
But the data tells us that's not true. They're just approaching things differently. Generation Z is putting forth innovation at a much steeper rate, partially because of the availability of technology. They're redefining what the workplace relationship is between employee and employer because of their bent on freelancing, the gig economy, their lens of entrepreneurship. So if you look at the data of these situations and you take yourself out of your wheelbarrow rut and say, I'm going to look at this objectively, you can usually disprove yourself and you can use all of the research at our disposal to do it
Yeah.
instead of being like, well, I'm not going to think that way anymore. 'Cause that doesn't really work.
Yeah. Can you think of any of those you've struggled with and you've had to kind of help yourself out of that rut yourself?
I can think of a ton of them. I'm trying to think of the one that would be most relevant for this conversation. But what I wrote about in the book of Leading Yourself is my own struggle of thinking that I picked the wrong job and I, kept finding these bad opportunities. And the punchline of the story is it was me. And
Mm,
I didn't realize how much power I had to change my situation. And I
yeah.
didn't realize that instead of waiting for an employer to give you purpose and meaning and opportunities and joy, that it was in your hands to create those things, even in an entry level role. So the biggest one to me is the wheelbarrow rut of I believe that my job should make me
Mm,
feel good and fulfilled and meaningful instead of what I believe now, which is it is my job to make sure I am having a meaningful experience. And that
mm.
is my responsibility, not the people around me.
That is so good. I'm glad you shared that because I think people would be able to relate. A friend of my son's middle school basketball team, he told him, I don't know if I'm going to try out next year. And my son was not so happy about that because he really enjoys this guy. And so why? And he goes, well, the players will be so much better and I may not get much playing time. And that situation came to mind when I was reading your chapter on risk because like my son's friend, I think we have a tendency to focus on the threats, right? The things that could go wrong and whether it's upcoming presentation or, what if what would happen to my career if this project fails, things like that, instead of balancing the risk with the upside. So what's an example when you were tempted to focus on just the threat of something and how you tried to lead yourself when faced with that?
So, what I wrote about in the book is my distaste of this phrase, trust your gut, because
Hmm.
it implies that your gut is accurate. I'm naturally kind of an anxious person, right? Like, I latch on to fear, potential downfall really quickly. And if I just trusted that gnawing feeling, I would never raise my hand for anything.
Yeah.
So, what I have had to learn to do painstakingly, and what I now advise people in leading yourself training to do, is to accurately articulate the potential upside. That doesn't mean you have to try out for the team. It doesn't mean you have to raise your hand. It doesn't mean you have to go put your resume on LinkedIn or wherever you
Right.
put it. Just give your brain a moment to articulate. What if it went awesome? What if this opened up a great door for me? What if my boss loved that idea? What if they were totally willing to meet with me? And giving your brain to permission to explore this optimistic alternative can be a game changer for your decision making. And whether you do or don't do the thing aside, you feel a lot more confident in the decision making process because instead of stewing about all the things that could potentially go wrong, those things are still there, valid.
Yeah.
I'm not going to
Right.
convince you otherwise. You have at least given a seat at the table to the things that could go right.
I so appreciate that section. You didn't make it like, oh, don't be negative, just be positive. It's not an out of touch sort of chapter. It's you just show it as like a fulcrum and a bounce, right? Like, yeah, okay, yeah, there's the risk, but think about this other side. And you also mentioned one of my favorite phrases in situations like this from the movie. Was it "We Bought a Zoo"? Is that the name
Yes.
of it? Yeah, yeah. Would you elaborate on that?
So there's this line, and We Bought a Zoo, where the main character's son is really nervous to ask this girl to talk or on a date. I don't fully remember the
I think you're
context.
right. I think that's right.
And the main character says, "Sometimes all you need is 15 seconds of insane courage, and I promise something great will happen." And in my mind, I'm like, you can't make that promise, right? I'm a skeptic. You shouldn't promise
Mm.
certainty. But I think what he captures is the essence of ripping the band-aid off and sometimes just going for it. The bent I wanted to take on fear and risk is to debunk this belief that you should just calm down and not be afraid, which is like the worst advice to hear ever, especially if you're anxious.
Mhm.
But instead, acknowledge all that stuff is over there and invite the possibility of a positive outcome to the table and let that occupy your brain just for a few seconds.
Yeah, just a little burst. I've used that over the years, and sometimes it's to start a difficult conversation, and what you find out, it often doesn't end up as bad as what you think. Yeah, there's so many good ideas in the book, but one of my favorites is you call it in the book a practice of "this is my chance." So would you explain that and maybe how you've personally used it?
So, This Is My Chance is a mental practice that I first learned from a woman named Tessa Romero, and she's a motherhood coach. But I found this practice, I learned it in the motherhood context. I found it radiating out into my professional life in a really profound way. So, This Is My Chance in motherhood is reframing an interruption, an annoyance, a frustration into an opportunity. And an example would be, your kid wakes up, they're puking all in the middle of the night. You're really great, awesome. I don't know what I'm going to do for work tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm probably going to get the stomach flu now. How you reframe it in the moment is, this is my chance to show up in a really loving and caring way. This is my chance to take care of my sick child in the way that I wish someone would take care of me when I was sick. You are finding some grain of an opportunity in there. You're not convincing yourself that it's the best situation. You're not discounting all of the reality and the ways in which this sucks. You are just pointing your brain to one element of opportunity. I used that practice in motherhood. I had a really colicky baby and really challenging postpartum period. And what I found myself doing when I came back to work was using it at work too. So if someone interrupted my day with some immediate, we need a revision, this is a crisis, instead of, oh, I can't get anything done, these people are constantly interrupting me, this is my chance to build trust in a challenging moment. This is my chance to make sure we are synced up now so we don't get bit later. And the more you can point your brain, again, not to discount the very reality that is challenging, but to find some glimmer of opportunity for yourself, you show up differently.
So someone may part of that what's sucking joy out of their job might be like, oh, well, AI might just take my job, right?
Yeah, I'm
This
thinking
is my
that.
yeah. So this is my chance. How would you fill
Yeah,
that
this
in?
is my chance to learn new tools. This
Right.
is my chance to bring my uniquely human skills to the fore.
Yeah.
This is my chance to lean on the relationships that I've built in the last several years.
Yeah.
There's always an opportunity. It may
Yeah.
not be more significant than the risk, but focusing on it doesn't cost you anything.
I love it. It's a way to reframe it to something that, like you say in the book, control the controllables, right? We can't control the other stuff, but control the controllables. So, yeah, I love it. Let's say someone listening to us has a meeting coming up and they're not all at all looking forward to this thing. I mean, at least one person at that meeting who's a pain to work with, often feel like they're an obstacle to progress, and meetings with them just feel like soul sucking. And I don't know about you, Elizabeth, but sometimes I feel like the anxiety leading up to those meetings is just as bad or worse than the meeting itself. So, how might you coach our listener to lead themselves prior to the meeting and perhaps maybe even during and after?
So we'll start with during or before and after, and your
Yeah.
sentiment that sometimes this lead up is worse than the actual meeting
Mhm.
is so true, and you are in control with how much brain space you are giving this soul sucking person. If you spend 8 hours leading up to this meeting that lasts for 1 hour, you've just given them 9 hours instead of 60 minutes. If you go home after this meeting and you start griping about it to your family at the dinner table, you've just given them even more time, right? This person, as a result of the calendar, had 1 hour of your time, and you've now given them 8 to 10 from mentally preparing for their awfulness and then repeating it to all of your loved ones afterwards.
Yeah.
So the first step is to recognize, yes, they may be awful. That might be a fact. They may be absolutely miserable to work with. You don't know what's going on with them, but it's a miserable experience for you. How much are you going to let that bleed? That's your decision. And if the answer is a lot, there's a huge price to pay emotionally. You're never going to deliver the shower speech, so best to just not give it.
Mhm.
Um, but how do you deal with that in the moment, right? When they're sitting across the table from you or in the corner of your screen, just being awful. You're always in control of your own response. The more you can anticipate it, the more you can prepare for it. But the other thing you're in control of is the periphery. And that's where we often lose our focus. The periphery is all of the
Mhm.
surrounding elements
Mhm.
of this
Mhm.
situation. So if your awful person meeting is in the center, the periphery is, where is the meeting? What are you eating and drinking during the
Mhm.
meeting? What are you listening to before and after the meeting? How much time are you giving this person at the meeting? Who else are you inviting that maybe you don't dislike to the meeting? What are all of the smaller levers that you can move to make this thing at the center less awful? You will find no shortage of support in commiserating at the awfulness of the thing in the center. But when you can put some guardrails around that in terms of how much mental time you give it before and after, and when you can move the smaller levers at your disposal, you can make an inroad at an isolated, challenging situation.
Sometimes, Elizabeth, what I'll do is I'll just walk in, look them in the eyes, shake their hand, say, "It's good to see you. I'm looking forward to the meeting," which is at least two lies. It's not good to see them, and I'm not looking forward to the meeting. But there is something about, I feel like what you do in this book is you give us ways to reframe it. And all of a sudden, by reframing, it does change us, even physiologically, right? Like you talk about, I think in that section about being well hydrated before the meeting, right? Gives us more
Yeah,
energy.
well, that's a twofold strategy because if you're well hydrated, you're showing up better, and also you get to take bathroom breaks more frequently, right? So you get these little tiny moments to reset yourself. But what I love about what you pulled out from that long-winded example that I gave is the power is always in your hands to make
Mhm.
these things less draining. And as humans, we're mirror, we respond energetically to the people, to the circumstances around you. And when you can lead yourself, you open the door for others to be led to.
That's a good point. I didn't really think of it that way. Yeah. We had a guest on the podcast some years back. He wrote a book about becoming indispensable. And he differentiated from being as opposed to irreplaceable. And it maybe just comes out how we define the terms. But I'd love for you to explain why you recommend becoming invaluable instead of indispensable, and maybe how that applies to you, and or at least to leading yourself.
I mean, words only mean what we think they
Mhm.
mean, and no
Yeah.
shade to whoever wrote
Yeah. Right.
Being
Yeah. Yeah.
Indispensable.
For sure.
I'm sure
For
it's
sure.
a
Yeah.
great book. But the essence of the point I wanted to make, and again, we can all use these words in different ways,
Mhm.
is that when you are indispensable, you cannot be replaced. You solidify your seat forever. If you're the only one who knows how to use that software, congratulations, you're going to be using that software forever. If you are the only one who can make nice with that customer is going to be yours forever. And when you shift your lens from that, I'm the only person who can do this thing,
Mhm.
to invaluable, I'm someone who's good at a lot of things in a variety of situations, I have great value, that's when more career doors start to open. And the frustration I saw in the research for the book Leading Yourself is so many people feel trapped in their seat. There was some research from Glassdoor that reported this year too. 2 in 3 office workers feel stuck in their job. And to me, one of the reasons that is we are sold this narrative that you have to be this indispensable, irreplaceable person in your role. But the reality is the people that are moving around and the people who have doors open for them prove their value in a variety of situations. And that's increasingly important now because the landscape's a changing, you know?
Mhm.
What's needed
Mhm.
yesterday won't necessarily be needed tomorrow.
Yeah. I feel like a sub theme through the book was we get ourselves out of a position of joy and all the rest of this when our identity is based on our job, right, or our project. And so there's ways to kind of separate that, and being valuable doesn't mean that just valuable in what I learned 10 years ago. It's I can be valuable with what I'm learning. And did I get that right? It's like if we can uncouple our identity with the job. And in fact, I think you mentioned we're even taught that at a young age. What do you want to be someday? Okay?
Right, as if you're not already a
Right.
human who exists, right? What
Right.
do you want to be?
Yeah.
And every time you're seeing someone new, your parents say, what do they do? Which is code for, are
Mm.
they educated and rich? We have no problem propelling this belief that we
Right.
are our profession. And I think that's being thankfully debunked. Some of it in my work, some of it in a really good book called The Good Enough Job that was written last year, and some of it propelled by Generation Z, of which I am not a part, but I'm certainly grateful for the scrutiny they've brought to the workplace and the boundaries that they set.
Yeah. A big something accelerated your career, or at least perhaps meaning and joy for you, was starting to do LinkedIn learning, and you wrapped up a recent shoot, as you say in the book, and you got some feedback that probably should have felt positive, but it made you feel terrible. So tell us about that, and maybe some important lessons you've learned about receiving feedback that could help me lead myself, or listeners lead themselves.
So I'll set the context for this with saying I first signed on as an instructor with a company called lynda.com
Mm.
about almost 10 years ago. And they were a training company that was growing really fast. And I made a course on, at the time, the trendy topic of millennial talent retention. Nobody cares about that anymore. Anyway, that company got acquired by LinkedIn Learning, and I, through the acquisition, became a LinkedIn Learning instructor. And LinkedIn Learning, if you're not familiar with it, is a library of courses on a huge variety of topics, like everything from sales to leadership to Photoshop to Excel. Like you can learn anything on LinkedIn Learning. And it's been great for my career because it's brought my work to, millions of people. On the flip side, millions of people have the opportunity to give me feedback. And my early endeavors, my very first courses, are some of them still live on the internet. You can go look at them. And so, after one of my most recent courses, after doing this for several years, I have 20 something courses in the library now. My producer's like, you know what? I looked at your first course and you have just grown so much. It is a night and day difference. Like, you have come so far. You're such a polished instructor, like saying all these things about my present state that I was like, okay, great. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed that this before picture of me is still live on the internet and anyone can comment. And I had to really, as LinkedIn Learning started to scale, come to grips with the fact that for me, feedback is going to be an ever present thing. And feedback on my early work is something that is also ever present. And in a lot of internal roles, that's not the case. Like your early work just goes into some server and dies, and mine still gets trolled by people on LinkedIn Learning. Um, but what I saw in myself in that struggle is an overemphasis on defaulting to negative feedback, which I think a lot of ambitious people do. Is certainly something I've seen in a lot of project managers defaulting to the one little bit that's not going quite right, the one, hang up that's keeping us from the timeline. And it's tough because on the one hand, and you hear this narrative about having a growth mindset, and it's challenging to recognize when it's gone too far. Is that something you've experienced?
Oh, I mean, it's somebody could say 10 positive things and there's that one thing, right? And it's like, oh, we ruminate over it. And I don't know if it's a form of perfection. I don't know if it's a one guest said underneath it is uh truly a sense of inadequacy. Like, well, let's turn it into a therapy session. Yeah,
Yeah, well,
but
this has
I
been
think,
the topic of many therapy sessions for me.
yeah, right,
And
yeah,
all of that is true. I mean, we all want to do well at work. We also live in a culture that is hypercritical. We're all like rating everything all the time. So
yeah,
the volume of feedback is something that our human brains literally cannot handle. It's a tough
yeah.
position to be in.
Yeah, but I think so. I have a son who's in the film industry, and for someone who's listening only to the audio, they won't be able to see this. But a director told him, I used to ask for feedback, and he would hold like a invisible like DVD cover in front of him and say, "Give me feedback on a movie." And whenever he got feedback, he'd be like, "Oh, it hurts." The director said he learned to put the movie metaphorically to the side. Give me feedback on my movie, and then it was about the movie, not about him. And so back to our point, our discussion about identity, that feedback, it's so hard not to take it as identity. Like, I was so bad back 10 years ago, right? As opposed to, wow, look where I've come from.
Yeah, and so much of what we've talked about here and what I write about in the book is my own like workplace angst of feeling like I wasn't doing good enough and work wasn't this big, fulfilling, exciting thing that I wanted to be, and trying to get to the root cause of why. And some of that is my own like dumb beliefs, and some of it is failing to recognize that the power I had could change the situation. It just didn't seem like it. So part mindset, part behavior, part relationships. But the through line to your point is this is some messy stuff we're all just trying to figure out, and we've wrapped our identity up in a really dangerous way.
Yeah, but we're not victims. And I feel like that's the major message out of the book, that we have agency on this. And there's so many things I'd love to talk with you about, Elizabeth, but let's end with this because we have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. Can you think of some things that you do to try to help your son just learn so that he feels that he is never powerless, that he can lead himself?
The dedication of my book was to my son, and I said, "You're never powerless." And it's a sentiment that I hope stays with him. From a parenting perspective, the most challenging thing for me to learn was to embrace the struggle as a mother, and I guess as any parent, when your child is frustrated or hurt and they can't do something, it's so tempting to like swoop in and
Mhm.
try and rescue them from that momentary pain. And I have had to really check myself on how often I do that and really pay attention to my language. And my son is a toddler now, so we're hardly having philosophical conversations.
Right.
But saying things like, you can do this, you can learn, you can try again. Like the messages that I need to repeat to myself in toddler lingo to hopefully make some generational progress on this self-leadership mindset that came to me in a more painful way than I hope he gets it.
Yeah, right. I have a tendency to want to swoop in. We've got 5 kids and 3 of them out of the house, and each stage has different ways of we can swoop in. Or I feel like maybe one of the big lessons, Elizabeth, is how am I modeling victimhood, or am I modeling, um, you know, we can do something about this. Let's figure this out. And I think they probably pick up a lot on that more than even our words, huh?
I mean, toddlers pick up on it from us. We pick up on it from our colleagues. Our boss
Mhm.
picks up on it from their boss. I think the through line is be the change that you hope to see, whether that's in the behavior of your child and you want them to be more, self-leadership, growth mindset oriented. How can you model that? Whether that's in the relationship you have with your boss. Do you want
Yeah.
it to be better? Do you want it to be more focused? How can you model that? The power is always in your hands to change the circumstance.
And I love your point, and we'll end with this, that it not only helps us, but it can bring some other people along too. And I got to tell you, for those listening, you've just gotten a taste of Elizabeth's new book. If you want a practical guide to find more joy, meaning, and opportunities in the job you already have, get a copy of her book, Leading Yourself. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks, Andy.
Well, special thanks to Elizabeth for joining us here on episode 458 of the People and Projects podcast. I like this book for a number of different reasons. I think there are plenty of good business books out there. They have models and they have stories and things like that. But I think a lot of what Elizabeth has done here is take situations where a lot of us just live in, where this is a difficult situation, whether it's stakeholders, whether it's projects, whether it's bosses. And instead of pointing fingers, instead of just blaming and justifying, instead of just shaming, like, man, maybe I don't have what it takes. It's one of those things where we can do something about it. What can we do? Maybe we can't make it into the perfect place to work, but can we make it better? I think there's so much value in us understanding the concept of agency, that we're not victims, that there's something we can do. A while back, and I have to look up the episode, I interviewed a guy who his actual job was if a company was struggling with an executive, they would bring him in and try to understand, like, is this executive savable? That's how he called it. That's what he called it. Is this executive savable? And he said, a lot goes into that. But one of the biggest things that he would look for is one thing: agency. Does the executive just seem to blame others, or do they feel like there's something that we can do? And he goes, if there's not agency, it's one of those things that his recommendation is not to keep them. He doesn't think they're savable. So I think this idea of our default is, hey, we don't know, but let's see if we can figure it out. This is not great, but let's see if we can make it better. I interviewed this guy, he's a former head of training at Facebook. And I think it was like the second chapter was something like this. Every organization sucks. Your job is not to make it not suck, it's to make it suck less. Right? And as inartful as that is to say it that way, I think there's some truth to that. No boss is perfect, right? No culture is perfect. And we're not going to be able to make it perfect. Certainly this book, nor any book is going to be able to make it perfect. But can we make it better? And that's really where Elizabeth goes with this book. And there's no room for toxic empathy of just think positive. She doesn't talk about, she talks about it in the book, but that's not what she's aiming for. She's like more avoid that sort of thing. And there's also no room in the book for if you have, let's say, a boss or stakeholders that are truly bullying, and there's technical definitions of what that means. And sometimes that is the case. And that is more of you got to get out of there. But there are situations where somebody is maybe not technically by the academic definition of bullying, but they're just a really difficult stakeholder, team member. What if we could make some ground in that? What if we could try to improve those sort of situations? And Elizabeth has some ideas in this book I think you would be able to relate to. As I mentioned during the interview, a lot of it comes down to there's so many things you can't control. You cannot. But can you control the controllables? Can you take the actions? And I think the book really encourages, I think in many ways inspires us to try to do that. If you pick up a copy of the book, I'd love to hear what you take away from it. You can reach me at show@peopleandprojectspodcast.com. And whether it's from the book or just today's discussion, I'd love to hear what resonated with you. If you'd like more on this topic, I put links in the show notes to episode 437. That's with Nada Sanders. And it's a career book about how do you future prep your career in the age of AI. And so we talked a little bit about that in passing, but I think, as you think about your career and how is automation and AI and other technological changes going to affect us, I think episode 437 with Nada is a hopeful sort of episode. Also, episode 318 with John Stepper. He wrote a book called Working Out Loud. And there's just so many practical ideas in that book of how do you build relationships? How do you keep thinking in new and fresh ways? John is doing some great work with his whole forums of Working Out Loud. You can be introduced to it in episode 318. And then episode 213 comes to mind with Christopher Avery. He's the author of a book called The Responsibility Process. And I call back to ideas from that book. It must have been more than 5 years ago that I interviewed the guy and read the book so long ago. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it's a rare week that I don't think about ideas from that book, where he talks about how we often just default to blaming and justifying and shaming and obligation, and all that'll make more sense once you listen to the interview. But none of that fixes it. You have to go over the line to responsibility. And so if you want to try to help yourself or your team, like, how do we take on more responsibility? Not take on more work, but how do we be more responsible? Less finger pointing, less blaming and justifying. Episode 213 with Christopher Avery can help a lot. Well, you know what? I just appreciate every opportunity we have to get together for these episodes. And if you haven't left a review for the People in Projects podcast recently, I'd love for you to do it. It helps. It's so encouraging to our team to read those. And if you haven't reached out in a while, send an email. show@peopleinprojectspodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you. It is so encouraging to hear what you're taking away. Any feedback you have on the podcast would be great. So on behalf of me and the team, thank you for listening.